evening, depending on where you're joining from around the world. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar, which is part of KAICIID's newly launched Faith for SDGs project, a digital storytelling series highlighting the role of faith in sustainable development. My name is Christine Luby. I'm a public affairs officer at KAICIID, and I'll be your moderator for today. Please kindly note that this webinar will be recorded and published on the KAICIID website. If you'd like to share today's discussion, or if you need to leave early, you can check the webinar registration page or our YouTube channel to watch the webinar again. We will be posting each of the webinars from our project at the end of next week. Today, we are also providing Arabic interpretation. If you'd like to listen to the webinar in Arabic, you can do so by clicking on the Spanish interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the webinar, we will be sending out a short evaluation form in the chat. We kindly invite you to take a moment to fill that out so we can continue to provide you with relevant content. I would also invite each of you here today to again use that chat function. You can introduce yourself during the webinar. Please state your name, where you're from, which organization you work with. We will also be adding in the biographies of our speakers here today so that you can take a look at those. And now I have the great honor of welcoming today's panelists. First, we have the Reverend Fletcher Harper. He's the Executive Director of Green Faith, which is an international interfaith environmental organization. Reverend Harper led the multi-faith organization of the 2014 and 2017 People's Climate Marches, and he is playing a lead role in the faith-based fossil fuel divestment movement. Welcome, Reverend Harper. Second, we have Rocio Fernandez from Green Climate Fund, which supports the efforts of developing countries in responding to the challenges of climate change. Through her work, Ms. Fernandez helps organizations access funding for climate change adaptation and mitigation projects. Welcome to you this morning. And finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Awal Abdusalam, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Geography and the Deputy Director of Academic Planning and Head of the Quality Assurance Unit of Kaduna State University, Nigeria. Welcome, Dr. Abdusalam. Before we jump into our panel discussions today, we'd like to start by sharing a short film from our project. Today's film focuses on United Nations Goal 7, renewable and affordable energy, and was filmed with Interfaith Power and Light on Navajo Nation in the United States.
Mexico, those people that are most vulnerable and often in rural areas, especially our indigenous brothers and sisters like the Dene or the Navajo people, are affected greatly by climate change, by the droughts that we have, the springs drying up, no food for their animals. And these folks, many of them live traditionally, and they do not have electricity or running water. And so even to help them with sustainable possibilities for the future, like solar energy that helps them have some lighting in their homes and maybe can pump some water, provide for small refrigerators that help them with their medication, are really, really vital because they're affected most. And it's in the same regions where often there's oil and gas industry that is feeding large metropolitan areas, and they have no benefit from that at all.
I am Hazel Henderson. I'm a Navajo, a Dene Navajo. This is a Key Willijim. He's a Navajo too, and we've been living here for 35 years, 36 maybe. And we got the solar panels not too long ago. Before we got that solar panel, it was hard. I'm on medication and I had to keep some in the refrigerator to keep them cool. And right now I have that refrigerator that they put in the house for me, and it helped me, it's helping. It was hard, not watching TV or making coffee all the time, if I want to make coffee, I have to build fire and get the stove hot and everything for the coffee to boil. But right now it's helping, I have an electric coffee maker, so that's what I'm using. And he likes to watch TV too.
New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light is the only religious interfaith-based organization in the state of New Mexico working on climate justice. And our mission really is to work with faith leaders, faith communities, and people of faith and conscience all around the state in an interfaith way to encourage prayer, inspiration, education, resources, and then practical applications of energy efficiency, renewables, and also some public policy advocacy.
Faith-based communities are very important in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, because I believe that together we can be a more powerful voice to the communities for achieving sustainable development and protecting Mother Earth and her inhabitants, and of course protecting the environment.
We believe in a phrase called in Hebrew tikkun olam, which means repair the world, and that we have a mission to continue to look to perfect God's world that was created for us. Having communities of faith collaborate with each other makes us all stronger.
So as a Muslim, I understand that we have been placed on earth for the purpose of taking care of it. It's good to be hearing, it's good to be knowing, it's good to be reading, it's good to be listening. But action speaks louder than words. The worldly comforts are not for me. The worldly comforts are not for me. I am like a traveler who takes a rest under a tree in the shade and then goes on his way. So let's use the symbolic tree for shade to nourish ourselves, but let's also follow the sunnah, his saying, his doings, and leave the symbolic tree intact so that the next traveler can use it.
I see my role as a leader within Interfaith Power and Light as one to help people across New Mexico and in faith communities realize they have strong foundations of wisdom in their spiritual traditions that can guide them in making choices and decisions for caring for creation in their communities as we move into climate change, and that they can be beacons of light and hope and action.
Has launched the Decade of Action, reminding us that we only have 10 years left to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030. But we are facing alarming setbacks and a global health crisis of unprecedented proportions. According to the United Nations Environment Program, climate change has not stopped for COVID-19. Greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere are at record levels and continue to increase. Emissions are heading in the direction of pre-pandemic levels following a temporary decline caused by the lockdown and economic slowdown. In our opening webinar of the Faith for SDGs project, we also heard from Dr. Iyad Abumogli at the United Nations Environment Program, who shared that less than a quarter of the 93 environment-related Sustainable Development Goal indicator targets are on track, while over 2/3 do not have enough data for their progress to even be assessed. We also know that 789 million people around the world lack access to electricity, similar to those people that we saw in the video. Additionally, only 17% of global energy consumption comes from renewable sources, not nearly enough to meet long-term climate goals at projected growth rates. These are immense challenges, but I'm so pleased to welcome our three panelists today who are committed to tackling them through interfaith partnerships. So with that, I'd like to turn our first question over to Reverend Harper to set the stage for our discussions here today. Reverend Harper, many religious communities are just beginning to explore the areas of environmental protection and climate justice. And I've heard you say at times that religious communities have been skeptical of environmentalists, and environmentalists have equally been skeptical of organized religion. What would you say to each of these communities to address their hesitations or concerns? And secondly, how do you bring people together around shared values of care for people and planet when they may be on very opposite ends of the political and religious spectrums?
Thanks, Christine, and it's good to be with everybody. I'll apologize in advance because my voice is not very good. I am having some issues with that this week. I think the very short answer is that religious groups have to step up their efforts considerably. There's been a great deal more work that has happened, and it was great to see my friend Joan in the video, and she's been doing good work with the IPL community for many years. I think we have to do a great deal more. There has to be a dramatic upswing in substantive commitment by religious groups in terms of and in the energy access space. I think very specifically, both on the donor side and on the investment side, recognizing that investment in energy access is the best way, one of the best ways to help advance the well-being of the 800 million people that you mentioned, Christine, who lack access to energy around the world. One really promising development is a campaign we're involved in called Shine, which is devoted to bringing religious and philanthropic foundation investors and donors together to look at how to support the growth of enterprises that are community-owned, community-led, women-owned, and women-led, so that the benefits, not only in terms of electricity, but also in terms of ownership of those enterprises and the financial and cultural and political strength that comes from having greater degrees of control over those productive assets is based at a community level. So I'll talk more about that later, but that's a start.
Maybe I could just ask you quickly, you talked about some of the financial benefits. What are some of the financial benefits for some of these businesses you've been working with, in terms of minority communities, marginalized communities, faith communities? What are some of those actual benefits and cost savings that maybe we see there?
So when communities shift from being off, not having access to electricity to having access, the data is unequivocal. There's an increase in productive enterprises, and so employment rises. People are able to make a better living within their communities. Access to healthcare, which the video showcased, is possible for storing medicines, for making it possible for medical procedures to take place that otherwise couldn't without proper lighting or proper access to electricity. Education improves because kids can study at night and are not bound to use kerosene lamps, which are terrible for their health and which also, frankly, pretty expensive. So those are the benefits you see. And when the ownership of those enterprises are based at a community level and are not based at the sort of multinational level, then you see local entrepreneurs, local business people developing those business ownership skills. And that kind of skill translates into the capacity to be more active in civil society, productively and constructively at the local level, which is really key. One of the troubling trends we see now is more and more of these sort of smaller scale energy access enterprises or medium size being bought out by major utilities based in Europe. And our concern is that that's just going to replicate some of the troubling patterns of the past where local communities don't have adequate control and access of the services that they need to power their own lives. So I think it's important to look at it both at we need to increase the power generation capacity, but be very clear about where the ownership of those assets are located.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think that's a really great segue into Ms. Fernandez. I'd like to pose a question to you. I know that one of the concerns that many individuals have about environmental agendas and climate agreements is how much is this going to cost? So from a funding perspective, how would you address those concerns? Where do we get the funding to do this? And how have you seen faith-based organizations been helpful in mobilizing funding and resources?
Yeah, so hello everybody, and thank you for your question. So indeed, as an individual, as a consumer, and I think also as a citizen, right, we also ourselves stop and wonder oh, how much is this actually, how much is an environmental agenda cost? How much is the Green Deal going to cost for both for the US and for Europe, for example? But I also think that we need to think the other way around. We need to think how much does it cost not to have it? So, for example, from the 2019 IPCC report, they actually estimated that in 2018, weather events cost us globally $400 billion, for example, or that the air pollution for burning fossil fuels was approximately $176 billion that is costing us per year. So we also need to think about that from a financial perspective. But there's also long-term costs that are we cannot put into numbers, for example, that affect our health, as the asthma produced from pollution, which is a problem that we I'm right now based in Korea. It's a problem that we have in Korea due to the pollution in there. The number of asthma in the population is increasingly growing. And that's something that we can actually put a monetary value on, but it's also something that is the cost of climate change. I think that from a funding perspective, for example, faith-based organizations play a key role in mobilizing funds, so they can be collecting funds from the World Bank, which is having a lot of projects in Africa with faith-based organizations, with the European institutions, from the UN, the UNEP program also has a lot of that, but also from private institutions in the social responsibility investment funds. So I think there could be a good collective money. They could also be really good at channeling resources, since faith-based organizations are already in the ground. They have first-hand knowledge, experience, and they know the stakeholders, and they can identify the gaps. They can also do the project trees, which is what then you're going to try to pitch to the funding and to the donors. So I think it's key. And also another key aspect of mobilizing funds is also maximizing the resources. It's not only getting the money, but also maximizing it in the ground. And I think that faith-based organizations, since they're already there, they can see where the duplications, where are some of the gaps that the project didn't identify properly, or which are some of the ways that the money needs to be channeled. I just want to share one small anecdote before I finish with answering this question, is that so actually in 2015, there was, thanks to the campaigning of faith-based organizations in the streets in Washington and in a lot of states in the US, the US actually pledged $1 billion to the Green Climate Fund. So also through campaigning, faith-based organizations actually also make their governments more accountable to climate change, and for them to be donors of climate change projects.
Maybe you could also share too, for some of our audience who might not be as familiar with the Green Climate Fund, a little bit about your organization and organizational model and what you're actually doing on the grounds. That would be really helpful, I think.
Sure. Please stop me if I talk too long, because of course, since it's what I do, I will just carry on forever. And my fellow speakers also need to talk. So the Green Climate Fund it was established at COP. So it's the cousin of the UN. It's directed by a board from developed and developing countries. And the mandate is to promote climate change projects in both adaptation, mitigation, or hopefully even better cross-cutting projects in developing countries, especially in SEEDs, LDCs, and African states, as they're considered the most vulnerable to climate change. So last year, the Green Climate Fund managed a replenishment of $10 billion that we have committed to spend in the next 4 years to promote these projects. So we do that through accredited entities. So unfortunately, as of today, there's no faith-based organizations as accredited entities. However, there's some in the pipeline. And if anyone is interested in applying or like knowing more how to get funding, like do not hesitate to contact me. But like some of them, for example, are like UNDP, UNEP, like UN institutions. There's also investment banks, also from the private sector. So sometimes also what GCF does is like leverage co-financing in forms of grants or equity. So also other investors will join, so they're like decreasing the risk of the investment.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that's a good transition now to Dr. Abdusalam. We'd like to move a little bit to Africa, and you're joining us from Nigeria. So I'd like to know, how have climate change and climate disasters affected Africa specifically, particularly in areas such as conflict and violence, internally displaced persons, loss of vital natural resources, which I know that you have a bit of a background in. And what do you think that faith communities can do to help? Just a moment, we're having a little problem hearing you.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better, thank you.
What I'm saying, the picture of climate change impact in Africa is not pretty, and the future
Mr. Abdusalam,
yeah.
we cannot hear you. Can you take off your earphones?
Can you hear me now?
We cannot hear you.
Okay, let me use. Can you hear me now?
Perfect, that's much better. Thank you so much.
Let me use not use the headphone. Well, what I'm saying is the picture of climate change for Africa is not pretty. One, because of the high vulnerability of the region, because of so many reasons. One, because of its location and the complex system of climate dynamics in the region, because even the climate models are finding it very difficult to predict most especially the issue of rain in Africa. Two, because of the low coping capacity of most of the countries on the African continent, especially in the sub-Saharan continent, and because of the high dependence right from history of the populace to agriculture, also especially rain-fed agriculture. So any change in the rainfall pattern can really induce a lot of havoc. And one most important thing that raised the vulnerability is high dependence on ecosystem resources, forest resources, indigenous people, rural people that have the highest, percentage of the population depend on these forest resources for livelihood. And the impact is going to affect almost every facet of life, most especially these four key areas. One is the agriculture. I mentioned water resources. Fresh water is a problem already, took place when climate change set in much. We've seen this in the Horn of Africa during the 2016 El Nino, which was intensified, maybe because due to the climate change, there was a lot of resources crisis in Ethiopia and Eritrea, which leads to a lot of conflicts in the region. And then comes to issue of energy, because I'm living in the city of Kaduna. Kaduna is one of the major cities in northern Nigeria, but unfortunately, 80% of the population living in the city use fuel wood, which is part of the forest extraction for cooking, which has a lot of health, impact on most especially women that are cooking. And then the issue of health is where it's so sensitive, because there are so many climate sensitive, also especially infectious diseases that are happy with the warming climate. And we're seeing increase in cases. I've done a lot of modeling with climate projection, looking at meningitis, cholera, and malaria, how it will affect Africa. And all the models are agreeing, and all the researchers I read are agreeing. Even the IPCC report is saying that we might see increase in prevalence of diseases, most especially those that are climate sensitive. We've seen the extension of malaria in the highlands of the north, where there is no mosquitoes, no malaria, but now in the highlands of Ethiopia, we've seen cases of malaria. And we're going to see more of disasters. This is part of the IPCC, I think, 3 past reports that there is tendency of increase in the occurrence of extreme events like droughts, like flooding, and water shortages, and so on and so on, and disease outbreaks, as I mentioned. And quickly, let me go to the faith leaders and faith organization, what they can do. I think I have these six areas I think the faith leaders and faith actors can do. One is to get engaged in sensitization. It is very funny that so many people living in the rural areas are not even aware about the impact, the risks, the danger they are facing. Talk less of adaptation strategies and forget about mitigation. Because we are not talking of mitigation, we are talking of adaptation. They don't even know how to go about it. That is one area that faith actors and faith organizations should do a lot of work. 2 is to engage in community-based adaptation strategies, implementation, and even simple research. I've seen that in South Eastern Asia, a lot of community-based are coming up with different beautiful ideas on how to adapt with climate change. 3 is to act as pressure group. These are respected people. The policymakers are respecting them because they are also part of their congregations. They have to speak out, act as a pressure group to these policymakers that most of them, to say the truth, most of them are not into, the issue of the climate change action and whatever. And then the 4th is to preach moderation, attitudinal change. I think this is grit is what leads man. It's what leads the world to the crisis, to the climate crisis we are in. So I have to preach, and then participate in action and negotiation. You say that this is the decade of action. They have to see participation being invited or inviting themselves or introducing themselves to decks of negotiation and talks about climate change. And lastly, thank you, Rocio Fernandez. You are from the Global Climate Fund. I think I've made mention this several times that faith-based organizations should know about the availability of these funds and should have easy access to this fund to fund the activities I made mention. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to just kind of throw it back to both of our other 2 panelists because I saw you both nodding at different points. Reverend Harper, I know you have a lot of experience in mobilizing faith communities and in raising awareness and sensitization, like Dr. Abdusalam was talking about. I wonder if you want to respond to any of those points from your own experience.
I would concur wholeheartedly with Dr. Abdusalam, and I think that faith groups really need to start to treat climate change as the emergency that it represents. I sit here in the United States where we have a very unfortunate governmental position in the current administration around this. And faith leaders must be very forthright and very direct and unequivocal about the enormous humanitarian and justice threat that climate change poses, and we must lead by example. I mentioned the SHINE campaign earlier. It's in the process of developing the demonstration phase of an energy access investment fund that would be designed very specifically to invest in and provide patient capital for those locally owned, women-owned and women-led energy access enterprises that need to blossom like 1,000 flowers in different places around the world. Energy poverty is concentrated in Africa and India. It happens in many other places as well, but we absolutely have to create a different kind of economic culture and moral culture that supports the development of these enterprises in ways that promote local leadership and local ownership. I think the other thing that I'd say is that we need, there's a way in which we need high-level religious leaders to follow the example of Pope Francis and to be much, much bolder in the way in which they engage the cultural and political context and economic contexts in their own communities. The time for polite reticence in terms of engagement is 10 years past. and we need to accelerate the pressure around this quite dramatically and extremely quickly. I think the last thing in 2 sentences is that countries in the global north, which have benefited disproportionately from the use of fossil fuels, need to play a strong leadership role in supporting the Green Climate Fund and other types of vehicles, because these countries have the wealth that they have because they've benefited from the use of fossil fuels. They need now to do the right thing and to make it possible for everybody to thrive.
Great, thank you so much. Ms. Fernandez, I also wanted to give you a moment to add some thoughts, if you wanted to, both Reverend Harper and Dr. Abdusalam, just in terms of mobilization, attitude changing, getting people really united around the work that you're doing.
Sure, and thank you. Yes, actually, like they're both, like I agree with both of your interventions. On the one side, like I also think that like faith-based organizations need to tap into all the available funding resources from international organizations, regional organizations, to act on climate change, since like it's such a big like community, and like there's so many people, and any behavioral change that is done through one or two, like it will impact 3 and thousands. So I actually think it's vital, if we actually want to tackle the issue of climate change, that the more we are, the better we will be. So faith-based organizations need to tap into those resources. And I was myself shocked that when I looked into the accredited entities at the Green Climate Fund, there was no faith-based organization on itself accredited. And I also thought that it was a pity. And I also thought like, oh, maybe we're not doing enough into encouraging people and actually letting them know what available resources it's for them to be able to tap on. So I completely agree that like faith-based organizations, there needs to be both. From a financial perspective, there financial institutions, there needs to be an engagement on like what is available, but also from faith-based organizations, there needs to be a bit of more proactiveness to know what could be there for them. And then also regarding like Reverend, yes, like that's actually why the Green Climate Fund was funded, and why the developing countries need the financials from the developed countries, because like developed countries like got where they are in the development due to carbon fuels, and their development like caused us the pollution and the problems that we have now. And we need to be able to fund developing countries to become developed without them making the same mistakes that we did in with pollutions. But also we need to be mindful that it's going to take time, and it's something that like not only do we need to encourage them to want to be green, but if we don't give them enough benefits to want to do it, they'll probably go for carbon actions because they're quicker. So normally like carbon actions are like linked to a quicker and like faster richness, when like green initiatives are normally considered like a long-term solution, which will get you maybe there but in 20 years. So I also think like we need to demystify that aspect, and we also need to give some sort of like a speedness to funding like green initiatives, and also for them to be able to see the growth of initiatives like faster.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Abdusalam, for sharing so many of those excellent points with us. I'd like to just pick up on something that you said, which I think is really interesting, and that's the connection specifically to healthcare. And I know, or I saw that you focused some of your doctoral research on climate-sensitive diseases, and you touched a little bit on that. But I'd love to hear more. What have you learned about the intersections between environment and health? And how can this help policymakers, and in particular religious institutions, because many of them are at the forefront of offering health services in Africa? We need you to unmute, Dr. Abdusalam.
Thank you.
There we go. Thanks.
Yeah, before that, just to encourage us, I implemented a project last week with religious leaders here in Kaduna. Coincidentally, which was funded by KAICIID. It's supposed to take place last year, but because of the COVID, extended to this year. What I realize is that these religious leaders are anxious to know about the climate change, to know about the impact, and to know what can they do to help. I've seen this in a very clear terms, and they took, I think I trained about 80 religious leaders, but Muslim and Christians, and they promised really, really to go back and work hard with their congregations about that. Well, regarding diseases, that is where their interest goes. Maybe because I have a bias in research, and maybe because that's the biggest challenge we're going to face, or we are facing already. There is clear, unequivocal evidence that there is link between diseases and environment. I think the COVID-19 is telling you that really our environment is where we get all these things, because we know it's a transfer of the pathogens or the virus from animals to man and as a host, and it goes there. So in Africa and in developing world, like I said, all climate models, or all the models, because we use models, they are prediction really, but I think they are telling us kind of insight of what is going to really happen. We're going to see an increase in infectious diseases. Some diseases might even go away because of the increase in warming temperature, but now we'll see resurgence of some diseases. So like I said, there is this link between environment and diseases. Put climate change on top, it's very clear, and it has been featured in so many reports and so many researches, yes.
I'm curious to know, you talked about you've been doing some awareness raising with religious leaders. How has that been received? Have you had to deal with differing viewpoints and perspectives? How have you brought people together around that? What's the reception in Africa?
I think the reception is quite high. Most of these religious leaders, because what I see is they want to know what is really going on. They've been hearing about this climate change, and I'm sure they've been asked questions by their congregations about what to do, and from the religious perspective. So they need to know what really it is, what are the real, potential dangers or already manifested dangers we are in. I think they were so happy, and they need more. They are asking for more of this engagement. And it's an opportunity for the interreligious dialogue, because this is an area that, in Nigeria, we have the two main Christian and Muslims and the friction. I think this is an area after football, this is an area that they can really, really come together, because it's a danger, it's something that everybody is seeing, and all the scriptures, but the Christians, the Muslim, and even the Jewish, though we don't have a very big Jewish community here, but all the scriptures are talking about environment, protecting the environment. They all agree on that, and I think that it's high reception, and they, look forward for more engagement. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Reverend Harper, I know that climate change is kind of an interesting topic within the United States, where we're both from. And I know that certain aspects of it can sometimes be tied to various political ideologies. And I know that you work with a lot of people from diverse political backgrounds and religious backgrounds. So again, how do you bring those people to the table? What's the reception? How do we unite around some shared and common values that we all have?
I think it's a vital topic, and there's, I think, something that I, as a religious leader, feel that I need to acknowledge to a wider audience, which is that there are very powerful elements within the religious community in the US, in Brazil, in India, in other parts of the world for sure, that are highly critical of efforts to address climate change. They resort to discrediting science. They often have strong cultural connections with extractive industries, fossil fuel sector, mining sector, the agribusiness sector. And I think that it's very important as religious leaders for us to acknowledge that this is a real problem, and that along with authoritarian governments and extractive industries, very often extremist, fundamentalist religious groups provide cultural cover and support for business as usual. I think that what's most important to do is firstly to name that quite directly and to note that it is immoral. It is in no way legitimate morally for religious leaders to support a business as usual regime on this. And that very simply may be uncomfortable or difficult for some religious parties, but we cannot shy away from it. I think a second thing is to note that the perceived ease of carbon-based development is the result of a large amount of government subsidy funding, which must be shifted to support renewables, and is also in some places underlain by a culture of violence. We have on our team a representative, I won't say what country he's based in, but he has been active in efforts to try to promote the use of renewables and to organize against the development of coal power, which is universally recognized as a train wreck for the climate and for human health. His life has been threatened on a number of occasions, and he is a respectful, faith-based environmental advocate. So I think we need to be very clear that there are reasons that it appears easier, and we need to change those. Those subsidy funds need to be shifted in an orderly but very clear way towards renewables. There need to be strong human rights protections for the environmental defenders, very often indigenous communities that are at the front line of protecting and fighting back against increased fossil fuel development. So it's a difficult topic, but we have to be direct about it, and we have to ask our religious brothers and sisters to step up and to stop supporting that kind of bad behavior.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to follow up with one more thing, Reverend Harper, because I think Dr. Abdus-Salam raised this quite well, which is that a lot of religious communities are quite hungry for solutions or ways that they can step up, but maybe don't know where to start. So where are some concrete places that maybe some of our listeners today who are just, entering into the areas of climate justice could start within their own communities? I know, for example, you've helped quite a few religious communities, I believe through Green Faith, with making mosques or churches or various houses of worship more environmentally friendly. So what are some specific ways that people could start?
Yep. So one thing I'll say is, and this is very exciting, on November 18th, there's going to be a new global multi-faith climate and environmental justice alliance that's launching. It'll be called Green Faith International Network, but it has partners in 14 countries across the world. And that community is designed to be supporting increased grassroots faith-based action on these issues. So I'll, not knowing exactly how many people are listening, but please, if you want to get involved, email me at fletcher@greenfaith.org, and I'll make sure that we get you connected with that. Because there is the good news is that there is a growing movement of grassroots faith-based leaders in different places around the world who take this stuff seriously and who are impatient for action. So we'd love to bring people together into that network. In Nigeria, there's an early stage of a formation of a Green Faith Nigeria, thanks to leadership by our good friend Muktari Aminu Kano at the Nigerian Conservation Foundation, for example, who's been reaching out to Muslim and Christian and other religious leaders across Africa, across Asia, Latin America, Australia. These groups are emerging everywhere. So I think there's promise, but we need to accelerate that pressure.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to just turn it back over to the panelists for any closing thoughts that you might have. Feel free to volunteer, and then we'll just wrap up our discussions today. Okay, great. Well, if we've covered everything, thank you so much.
One thing I'll say is that I think it's very important, and I appreciate so much what Ms. Fernandez said. I think that religious groups need to be aware of the Green Climate Fund, and in some countries need to be pushing their governments hard to pay up or to pay more for the Green Climate Fund. I know that it's not appropriate for her to say that kind of thing, but as a religious person, I want to say, look, we need more resources, a lot more resources going into those funding mechanisms. We need global North countries and governments doing a lot more. We need governments. I mean, I think there were very important interventions offered earlier about the reality of the need for adaptation at a time where we've got so many global North governments and some in global South regions stoking religiously based and ethnic based fears and violence. We're in a time where we are going to need to develop a global culture of compassion to welcome more climate refugees, some of whom will be internally displaced within countries, others of whom will have to cross borders to have safe homes. Religious communities, we are about compassion and love and justice. And we need to make it clear that these are the rules of the global culture that need to happen, not fear, not hatred, not anxiety, but a boldness of compassion and of love so that we can make this transition together in a peaceful and good way. And mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund, the linkages between taking care of people's health, like Dr. Abdus Salam mentioned, these are vital pieces of the picture.
So from my side, before we close, I would like to say that like it's really refreshing also to see like the other side, right? Like from a funding donors perspective, sometimes like we tend to lose touch to what's actually happening on the ground, or what Dr. Awija is doing with like the diseases and the studies, or like what Reverend Fletcher was talking about, like gender and like SMSEs. That's a really hard word in English. So like it's really also good to see that like there's more happening than just like multinational banks like saying that they're going to pay for like electric cars or electric buses in India and Karachi and stuff. So it's also really refreshing to see that. I also like the same KAICIID for like being a bit of a bridge between like funding and faith-based organizations, and like maybe like trying to develop more of that and like provide a more window of opportunity of like connection and resources. So I think like that's a really good job that you guys did here, not only with me, but also like to think of also of other organizations or also other funding opportunities that are out there. So I think that's also really important. And I would just like to finish saying that like, as much as like climate change needs funding, like we also need to think of the co-benefits that like having and making these actions has on all of the issues that we raise here about health, agriculture. Everything that we tackle has also a co-benefit on health, on agriculture, on like security, on safety. So there's also things that like, that's also the message that maybe it should be sent to the people. It's like, not only are we doing something right now, but we're also going to benefit from doing these actions, not only in the long term, but in the short term, from like immediate actions as the co-benefits. And I think that's also an important message when we talk about climate change, because sometimes you just think about climate change or like having to lower the degrees, and it's such an intangible like goal that sometimes like people tend to just like give up the fight because like it seems like really far off. As an lonely individual, you feel like you can't do anything because, as the Reverend Fletcher was saying, like there's big companies and there's big political like aims and investments around. So as an individual, I think that if we focus not only on the long-term goal, but in the co-benefits that we can see and are tangible to us, like the fight against climate change will be much more endurable.
Okay, can I chip in?
Please do. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, these are very powerful closing remarks from the two panelists there. Well, I would say I'm very happy with two things this evening. Here is evening, so yeah. One is KAICIID is taking this path of bringing faith with environment, and I think this is one of the areas we've been calling, and this is great. Two is hearing from the Rocio Fernandez about the Green Climate Fund, but maybe this required a kind of activity or an action to make sure we bring these FVOs or the faith-based organization to know that they can have access to this fund to work for the environment. And well, finally, thank you for the honor and the opportunity to be on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to each of our panelists today. We had some really fantastic dialogue here, and I'm very excited about it. Just to close us today, for those of you who are still listening with us, you can find additional resources on Goal 7, as well as the film that we showed here today on our website. That's at www.KAICIID.org/faith4SDGs. Once again, please check the chat box. We put the evaluation form in there. If you could kindly fill that out, that would be a great help to us. We also hope that you'll join us again tomorrow at 4 p.m. Central European Time for our webinar on Goal 8, Access to Decent Work. You can also find that webinar by going to www.KAICIID.org/faith4SDGs and clicking the Register Now button. So on that note, I want to wish all of you a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you so much for being a part of this project. It's really been a pleasure.